and I'm the CEO of Cure, and I want to welcome you all to a very special fireside chat, which we're holding in conjunction with a very successful and wonderfully stimulating day-long course in the how-to for entrepreneurs. And so I know that all morning long you've been learning about the how-to of company formation, IP, how to work with boards, etc., and you have more of the same coming up this afternoon. But guess what? You know, when you raise money, you raise capital, you can do it from VCs or you can do it from the government. And so we're going to talk a little bit about, you know, those opportunities. Joining me today is a good friend and colleague, Dr. Rick Young. So Rick, welcome to Cure. And I'm going to introduce Rick. Rick actually used to be the former director of BARDA, which is part of the Department of Health and Human Services. And Rick was actually the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response at the Health and Human Services Department, and has worked for a long time in the area of immunology, infectious diseases, and he was the mastermind behind the way we accelerated the vaccines during the COVID-19 pandemic. And Rick was responsible for leading the charge on ensuring that the government worked with pharmaceutical industry to bring forward the vaccines in record time. After that, he joined the Rockefeller University Foundation as the CEO of the Pandemic Research Institute. But Rick has so much more to bring to the table because he's worked with thousands of companies in his role as BARDA, small companies that are working on, you know, the latest innovations. And so we're looking forward to talking to Rick. Welcome.
Thank you, Seema. It's great to be here. I'm excited to be here in what some people might find to be an intimidating room, full of entrepreneurs, full of lawyers, full of those that are on the cusp of their growth in space in this exciting world we call health and healthcare and innovation. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, and of course it's nice to see all of these entrepreneurs here because Cure, as you know, we are building an ecosystem here. Cure is an innovation campus, and what we do is we really celebrate new ideas, entrepreneurship at the intersection of disciplines, sectors, and geographies. So great to have you all here. So Rick, I'm going to get right down to it. Let's first start with, first of all, your background. So I described some of it already, you know, immunologist, infectious disease specialist. How did you end up at HHS?
Wow. Well, I wanted to save the world. As simple as that. And to do so, I wanted to really find ways to develop better vaccines, better drugs, better diagnostics, and integrate those into a healthcare system that ensured they were available for everyone around the world so we could get in front of a rapidly emerging or spreading infectious disease or pathogen. So I always had that in mind. And so after I finished grad school with the Ph.D. in immunology and molecular biology, which is otherwise pathogenesis, which is otherwise virology, so we get big fancy words for it, but I worked at the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, for many years, and focusing on influenza and avian influenza, one of the viruses bird flu that we think could and probably still likely will be a major pandemic and one that would be even worse than what we've seen with COVID. But after my years at the CDC, I joined a small biotech company called Novavax. And Novavax was developing a novel technology for rapid vaccine development. And you see now they also play a critical role in the pandemic response. But while I was at Novavax, I was recruited to a nonprofit organization, NGO, a non-government organization called PATH. And PATH had a focus on accelerating the development of novel technologies for vaccine development and technologies that we could make available and transfer for production in low and middle income countries. So it was really one of my first taste of developing novel technologies, working with small companies. These weren't really large companies vested in developing a new vaccine technology at the time, but working globally. And it got the attention of BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, in the US Department of Health and Human Services. I've always had a fascination for long titles on my business cards, by the way. So it's all about the organization and acronyms.
The acronyms, yes.
But BARDA, of course, gave me that opportunity, not only to work in developing countries, low and middle income countries with an international program I led, but also allowed me to launch new programs in developing technologies for vaccines.
That's great.
And it gave me that experience at the helm of an organization in the government, which many people don't think of as being innovative or fast or you know,
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
But it gave me the opportunity to work with companies, large companies, small companies, companies around the world, and find ways to partner government with the private sector and accelerate innovation.
Absolutely. And we're going to come to that in a second because, you know, you launched some very cool initiatives, right, in what we typically consider to be a very bureaucratic place with the US government. But before we dive into that, one more question. So BARDA was established soon after 9/11 and the threat of biomedical warfare, right? That was the origin of BARDA, and so it was focused on biomedical threats. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, BARDA, I mean, one of the real driving forces for the establishment of BARDA, of course, is our national security. And BARDA focused on national health security and threats that could be imposed to really have a significant impact on lives in the U.S. From biological warfare and threats such as anthrax, smallpox, plague, tularemia, avian influenza, or pandemics, but also chemical warfare, radiological warfare, nuclear warfare, things we call CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear warfare. Some of this was follow-on from the 9/11 attacks. Some of this was because of the threats for pandemic influenza, and it was the Bush administration, George W. Bush administration, that really read a book about the next big pandemic and said we have to do something. We have to prepare our nation for these types of threats, and we needed an organization within government. There still isn't one that exists other than BARDA to really bridge the valley of death between the government and the private sector. We saw small companies and large companies working with NIH. You can get some grants, you can get some SBIR grants, as small business grants, you can get some R01 academic grants and different types of funding at NIH. You can take your product candidate through a phase 1 clinical study. NIH has great programs, animal models, and the clinical trial infrastructure. And then what? Things get very complicated. Things get very expensive. A lot of legal stuff comes into play. A lot of IP comes into play. Once you have some valuable data from that first clinical study, things really start changing. And there was not an organization in government that could help you. So we call that the valley of death. So you got past that phase 1 and you just land it. You, your company, your startup, your innovation in that valley of death. So BARDA was created to bridge that valley of death, identify innovation, and accelerate the innovation to FDA approval, and that's key, the FDA approval for your new drugs and vaccines.
Key. Yes. So at BARDA, one of the things that you implemented was a whole new innovation strategy that was fast and nimble and quick. And I don't know that many people know about that and ways to work with BARDA. So can you talk a little bit about how you did that and what was the impetus for doing that?
Well, the impetus of doing that,
and this is even before the COVID-19 pandemic.
This is before COVID. I mean, the government will never be accused of moving fast, so don't even try. But we can move fast, honestly, and we can be very effective when we want to be and when we need to be in the government. And as I said, before BARDA was created, there was this valley of death. So all of these amazing technologies from entrepreneurs and companies, small and large, were just piling up, accumulating in this valley of death. They were not getting approved by the FDA. In the 10 years that I was at BARDA, we figured out a system to get 60 new vaccines, drugs, and diagnostics approved by the FDA in that period of time. No other company or entity on the planet has that track record. So what did it take to get there? and how did we accelerate development? And that was basically by replicating a biotech company within government, bringing expertise, especially in innovation and contracting and management and partnering with private sectors, and our special relationship we built with the FDA. One of the biggest fears of any entrepreneur probably is getting to the stage where they have to talk with the FDA.
Yes.
And wonder how I can move through that bureaucratic organization. So BARDA figured out a secret sauce for that. I'll save for just a little bit.
Okay.
But we still weren't moving fast enough,
Yeah.
Seema. I mean, we were largely working with large pharmaceutical companies, multinational organizations.
So you marry slow with slow.
Yeah, our contracts that we put in place were, $300 million. So it took a lot. It took reams of notebooks and papers to submit a proposal to BARDA. What I found out when I became the director of BARDA, I talked to a lot of the companies when I met entrepreneurs, and why aren't you applying for BARDA funding? The answer that came back to me is we can't afford to apply for BARDA funding.
Why is that?
It took $1 million or more for a small company to find an organization that would work with them and put their science together and their business proposal and their legal proposal and their marketing plan and submit a proposal. The paperwork to submit for BARDA to get funding cost a small company $1 million. And this was when I was at a small company called Novavax back in the early 2000s. It might be $2 or $3 million by now.
Yeah.
So all of the innovation I encountered when I met entrepreneurs at meetings around the world was not getting through the doors of government. To shake my hand as a BARDA director, companies would pay lobbyists or consultants $10,000 just to shake my hand in the receiving line after I stepped off the stage.
Wow.
So I was seeing the same people.
Yeah.
I was shaking the same hands.
Not
I was seeing the
innovation.
same proposals. I was seeing the same consultants. And so we were not addressing many of the challenges that we needed to address, because the solution to many of those big problems we have is innovation.
Yes.
Entrepreneurs, the ideas that were happening in the garage doors, in the
Yeah.
garages across America. And so I knew I had to change that model, and I even called it somewhat of a cottage industry. It was an established system. It was very expensive. It was not inclusive. We were not getting small business. We were not getting minority-led business. We were not getting women-led businesses. And therefore, we were not getting the solutions the world needed.
Yeah.
And so I started a new division in BARDA called DRIVE, the Division of Research, Innovation, and Ventures.
Nice.
The venture part was I started a venture capital fund in government.
Yes.
We'll get to that
Yeah.
later. But the whole concept for DRIVE was to open the garage doors across America. I envisioned the early days of Microsoft with Bill Gates and the others and the Google founders that were in their garage tinkering, and then look what happened. But they had to have their entree in the world,
Yes.
and working with government even
Yes.
in many cases. But the entrepreneurs I was meeting didn't have that. So BARDA initiated a number of accelerators and incubators around the world.
Yeah.
I got that idea from working with Johnson & Johnson and J Labs.
Yes.
I walked
Those were the days when we.
Those were the days,
That's
Tima.
how we got introduced to each other. Yes.
I walked into a J Labs facility in California. I was just there for a different meeting out in the region. It changed my world. I saw the entrepreneurs roaming the hallways. I saw the wraparound services. And I asked Melinda Richter and others who were at the J Labs, I said, how do you attract these entrepreneurs in your space, and why am I not seeing those people, those same ideas at BARDA Industry Days? And so Melinda Richter and I, on that first meeting, said we're going to do something together. I'm going to change how government does business. I'm going to bring innovation into government. And I'm going to work with J Labs. We launched our first quick-fire challenge on respiratory protection within 3 months of that meeting.
Yeah, that's fabulous.
But
We're going to be launching a quick fire challenge here at Cure, which we'll come back to later. as well.
That's going to be exciting.
That's going to be
We're well
exciting.
experienced.
Well experienced with this, yes.
But I just had to see real quick. So
yeah.
we had to change contracting. You know,
Yeah.
I could not expect an entrepreneur to come in with 10 boxes delivered by UPS for a proposal and flash drives. So I changed the process of getting government funding from BARDA into a 2,000-word abstract. I changed the process on how our contracting officers met with the legal office and the lawyers from small entrepreneurs. I also had to change the cap. So to get into government, and there's no longer about a proposal for $300 million, although we'd all love to get there.
Yeah.
But it was about a cap of $749,000 to get your idea into the government. I chose that number because that was the signature authority I can go to with my project managers without going through 10 more layers of bureaucracy.
That was the maximum that you could sign off on without going to your
project
boss.
managers, even before coming to me.
Yeah.
So wouldn't you have to sit on my desk and wait?
Yes, that's great.
And I also ask a lot of small entrepreneurs what they would need to get over that next milestone.
By the way, that's the cap. You could come in lower than that.
Oh, much lower.
With ideas, brilliant ideas that could be much lower than that.
I set metrics that we had to have metrics for small businesses, for women-owned businesses and managed, for minority-owned and managed businesses. I set requirements for skin in the game. So every entrepreneur that came into BARDA through that DRIVE program had to bring 30% of the cost of that proposal with them. And so the number of calls I got from small groups and entrepreneurs might be one person, might be two people or so. Like, how in the world do I come up with 30%? Well, and we had the conversations about what you're bringing is in kind. I'm not asking you to bring cash, but put your ideas forward, put your technology forward, your space forward, your partnerships, relationships.
Your
of the
personal
total cost
human
of this.
resource hours.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't have that in government. You do. Bring that intellect, put the value. And it was really interesting, the conversation I had with a lot of small companies and entrepreneurs who were undervaluing their own ideas and their own mentality. Yeah. And so I was helping them put a value on their mindset, on their mentality, on their knowledge base, and bring that in to the government proposal.
That's phenomenal.
And it made a huge difference.
Was there, I mean, how quickly could you implement this? And we're going to talk about where we are today and how entrepreneurs in this room can go to DRIVE and apply for that kind of funding, right? So how quickly did the immune system of the government reject and react to this new model?
Yes, but I think initially I started too big for government to try to swallow in one bite. I started with a program it's now called ARPA-H. 2018, I pitched the concept to Congress and others about a BARDA focus on health. Because remember, BARDA was focused on national security and health security for those biological threats. We really didn't have a BARDA for health, for cancer, for Alzheimer's, for rare diseases or so. And so I was pitching something much larger, another BARDA for health. And we call that HARPA, Health Advanced Research Projects Authority, and now it's called ARPA-H. So that eventually took off. And so to minimize it for easy digestion, I started this division within BARDA called DRIVE, and I was able to take a few $1 million, actually maybe $50 million, out of the BARDA budget one year and kind of shift it over to that division. I had to, cut some corners in some other divisions to do that. But I had to, again, put my own skin in the game for the BARDA budget.
And created a pool of funding.
Create that pool and brief Congress and brief and brief and brief and brief and brief. And after our first year of operations, the budget request for fulfillment and sustainment of that program came through from Congress as a line item to help develop innovation. Now, we had authorization language in our PAPA, which is the Pandemic All Hazards and Preparedness Act, which was called PAPI the following year when it was renewed, or the following cycle was renewed, which added that I at the end of it for innovation.
Yeah.
And so I fully leveraged that I, when Congress reauthorized that.
Popeye.
Popeye, and yes, and use that for innovation to start this innovation division in BARDA. And we started with just 1 or 2 programs to solve sepsis. You know, we're doing things of solving sepsis now. And wearable technologies for diagnostics to empower individuals to detect pathogens and be aware of their exposure so they can seek treatment, change their behaviors, and which played a big role in the pandemic. And then they expanded beyond, because I had the vision of vaccines on demand. Instead of large pharmaceutical companies in a few places around the world making all the vaccines for the world, I imagine we might have a pandemic one day where everyone would need access to vaccines even sooner. And so I started driving the technology to vaccines on demand. I had a picture of the red box, some of you may have seen where you rent videos, but I call this the med box, where you can walk up and put your fingerprint in or so, or your eye scan, and it would synthesize your vaccine on demand or your drug on demand and make access to drugs and vaccines more accessible. And I'm happy to see that after I left BARDA, the director of this program, Sandeep Patel, who I was lucky enough to put in position there, has really taken these ideas and expanded not only these and made successful progress, but is doing so much more in that BARDA drive.
So that brings me to the question of the moment, right? So how do entrepreneurs in this room or others who are listening on LinkedIn Live or anywhere else, what's the best, because it's kind of when you think about applying for, you know, money or grant from the government, it's a little intimidating because, you know, you don't know how to navigate. It's so big, you know, where to go, how to do it. Do you have some advice for people on how to do it? What kinds of opportunities are there? How do you do it, and how can you successfully compete for a grant from the government?
I can tell you something that I know a lot of companies pay millions of dollars for.
Okay.
Millions. I can save you all millions of dollars right now. Because I set up a program in BARDA called TechWatch. And if you pay an advising company, a consulting company, $10 million retainer, they will introduce you to BARDA TechWatch. It is a simple web address. And the person who runs that is Dr. John Tagaris. You will never meet a more outgoing person in your life who is more interested, invested in getting you and your ideas and your technologies in front of the government than anyone you'll ever meet. It doesn't cost you a dime. Go to the BARDA TechWatch website. Schedule a TechWatch meeting and go to it. Don't send your consultant, don't send your company advisor, whether you're paying money for it. Go to it yourself, because you will in that meeting be able to meet with and share your idea at any stage with the FDA, with the NIH, with the CDC, with BARDA, with the Department of Defense, with DARPA, with ARPA-H, with all these government agencies who want nothing more to learn about your innovation. It doesn't cost you a dime. There's so much value in that because they're going to give you feedback in that meeting about your technology, how it addresses a government need, which agency is better for you to seek funding from at that stage of your development. Should you write an NIH grant? Should you go to the Department of Defense? Is BARDA the right place? Is DRIVE the right place for you at this moment in time? And you're going to not only get that feedback, but what you're doing is starting an educational process with the government scientist who will make the decisions on your funding, on your regulatory pathway, and your eventual approval of your technology if it's in the healthcare space. Yeah. And so you want to go to those TechWatch. When the SARS-CoV-2, the coronavirus pandemic started, I switched the name of that TechWatch to Corona Watch. And so you might see Corona Watch out there, you might see TechWatch out there. They're the same thing, but it's an interagency opportunity for you to educate and get that guidance. Go to those. Now the other thing is BARDA and ARPA-H and DoD, Department of Defense, are sponsoring all of these salon series now. You'll see them constantly. There's something they'll put out. We have a request for information, an RFI, on next generation vaccines. They hosted these little workshops. And I know a lot of people who pitch their ideas to me, and they say, oh, I can't get government attention. I say, you have to go to these meetings. And they're free, they're virtual, they're in person. I would suggest you go in person if you can get there. But this is the government putting an announcement out to the world that we want a solution to next generation vaccines. If you don't engage in that opportunity, eventually that request for information turns into a request for proposals. An RFI goes to an RFP. In that request for proposal, there's a lot of criteria, a lot of specificity that lands. And then small companies in particular will look at that specificity and say, I don't meet that, therefore I'm out of the game. You know, number one is large companies, very well-paid consultants that are attending those RFI sessions, they're shaping those requirements. You want to get in there to help shape those requirements to what you're making. You want to educate the government that you have a solution, so when they put those requirements out, keep what you're making in mind. It's going to guide that. Second of all, when the government puts out an RFP, they really still don't know what they want. And so, again, the very high-paid consultants know that, and they still get in there and help shape those responses. The smaller companies are intimidated by that, and they let that keep the door closed. Every time you see any solicitation from the government, we have these RFPs, the request for proposals. When that has certain criteria, don't let that stop you. Call that agency, get into a tech watch, still educate them on what you're developing. The other thing to watch for are these broad agency announcements, BAAs. That's what ARPA-H is using. That's what the Department of Defense uses, and that's what BARDA is using more and more now. A broad agency announcement, and for a drive, I actually changed some of those to easy BAA to make it even simpler. Watch for those announcements. That's the government telling you, we need a solution. We have no idea what it looks like. I can't even specify it. But what those are is an open invitation to small companies and entrepreneurs and inventors to meet with the government to say, I have your solution. Look at what we're developing. Meet with us. And that is your main entry through a doorway for government funding. Broad agency announcements, tech watches, and those little salons they put out. You don't have to spend tens of millions of dollars to get in the government.
Excellent advice. I'm going to turn to the audience here and see if they have a question before we go further. Anybody? Yes. There's a microphone coming.
Thank you for your time. I was looking at like stage 1, stage 2, at this point stage 1 grants. Is that similar or different to what you're talking about, or is it something separate?
So you're talking about grants then from the NIH?
Yeah, NIH, but there's also, it looks like other agencies are in the pot as well, like DOD and et cetera.
Yeah, so again, watch the language very carefully when they're talking about the grant versus the contract versus other transactional agreement or those types of jargon that government uses through. And even in BARDA, a lot of people think we give grants in those areas, but there's really partnerships and contracts. And it's generally, NIH does most of the grant making and some of the Department of Defense. But even in those grant scenarios, the concept for a small entrepreneur or a new entity is to get in front of those. Watch for those announcements. When you see the government, Congress saying, we need an initiative on next generation vaccine, you see authorizing language that comes out from Congress saying, we need to accelerate development of a new drug or vaccine or a new target area of innovation. That is your opportunity to get in front of the NIH, if it's a grant, or a Department of Defense. And the opportunity to do that are those Tech Watch meetings. And so don't wait for a grant announcement to come out. Don't wait for an RFI or an RFP to come out. When you see the government making movements or words about a need, an initiative, call the Tech Watch program and ask for a Tech Watch meeting. And you can have multiple of these. You can have as many as you think is important. And you can ask for them to help shape the audience of that Tech Watch, the participants. Say, we want to talk to whoever is leading this stage 1 grant initiative, or stage 2. We want to talk to the Department of Defense people who are working on some new chemical warfare thing, or in a diagnostic device or so. And they can help shape that audience. So when you get into that meeting, you're kind of pitching to the agency that's going to put out that solicitation or has put out the solicitation. It's really important to know that when the solicitation goes out, the opportunity to speak to the government closes. There are laws and rules in contract in this big FAR, the Federal Acquisition and Regulations, that we have this big book. That says once the solicitation is out, we can't talk to companies anymore. Silence. And so you want to get in front of that, and it's up to you, and that's why people pay other agencies a lot of money, or these companies a lot of money, is to sort of watch that movement, have your ear to the ground, especially in your particular area, and when you see that movement, get into that opportunity to communicate and educate.
Thank you.
Another question here and then there.
Thank you. This was really insightful. I'm just wondering, so just following up on that question, so like if you're applying for an NIH SBIR, the timeline can be like 9 months from the time that you actually apply until if you're successful, you get the money. Do you know if there's anything that's being done to shorten these timelines? And also, do you know anything in particular about ARPA-H, what their timelines are like?
So I can say that there is a strong desire to improve efficiency across the government, because what you've highlighted is a very common issue. I mean, moving at the speed of government is not the same as moving at the speed of innovation and your entrepreneurship. And that's one of the reasons why also I started Drive, because when you submit a proposal to BARDA, it can take a year or 2 sometimes to get that contract awarded, those large contracts. But in BARDA Drive, we have it in 30 days. And so we set our goal, we target it 45 to 60 days. Well, we prove that we can make awards in BARDA Drive in less than 30 days in some cases. What makes that go faster is how familiar that review panel is with your technology. And that means how much homework you did in advance. When BARDA Drive staff are at different meetings or conferences or so, look for them on the agenda, ask for a little one-on-one meeting with them, and grab them, shake their hands, and take that 2 minutes and tell them who you are, what you're developing. That familiarity that they have is going to make that process go even much faster. Now, during the pandemic, at the start of SARS-CoV-2, things were moving very slowly. We had certain agreements in place, other transactional agreements with large pharmaceutical companies. And that is how we started moving really quickly with those types of flexible agreements that we used in governments. But the small entrepreneurs were not a part of those large other transactional agreements. And so we used BARDA Drive as an on-ramp to start moving quicker for those innovative ideas, especially in the diagnostics and the testing and the immunology areas. And so then the goal was to on-ramp quickly while you're educating the rest of the organization on your technology, so you can start a second-tier application process and move faster. I would say the envy from Big BARDA to BARDA Drive has really been helpful in some ways, because I think all of BARDA has learned now to improve the efficiency to move faster. And I think because of that, because of what we now know is possible in an emergency response, that is driving this government-wide initiative to close those windows and gaps. ARPA-H, it's a new organization, and what I'm most excited about ARPA-H is because they are looking at every way possible to break the mold on the bureaucratic process of government moving too slow to match innovation. ARPA-H is all about innovation, big field-changing innovation. They're less about probably developing a specific drug or a specific vaccine, and more about systemic change and changing the healthcare system overall. But you see them using flexible contracting and partnering tools and different approaches. And you see them bringing in dynamic program managers. And one of the models I see them using, I think is exciting, is almost a DARPA model. You bring in a program manager around a big idea, you want to solve a big systemic challenge. And that program manager then can set that program up and then start distributing funds and building a portfolio, focus on that systemic challenge, and move very, very rapidly without a lot of the bureaucratic barriers, I would say, albatross in some ways that slows down. But we need to get government to move at the speed of innovation, and that is what a lot of these new programs you see emerging now in government are all about.
Well, Rick, thank you. I know that our LinkedIn Live audience especially is coming to a close, so we're going to wrap it up.
Seema.
Yeah, I know it was really fast.
Oh.
I know we have a question in the room, and we'll take that question. But for the audience, on virtual LinkedIn Live with us, thank you so much for joining, and really appreciate it. Tune in again for our next Tuesday talk coming soon. Thank you.